Good morning and welcome to our webinar on this wonderful Wednesday, April 10th. I'm Paige Backman. I'm a co-chair of our firms of Airden Burles's Privacy Data Security Group, and I'm here with my wonderful colleague, Don Johnston, who also co-chairs the firm's Privacy Data Security and Technology groups at our firm. This morning, we're going to talk to you about data breaches, where the risks are, and of course, everybody's interested whenever a data breach happens, how do you determine when to notify people? The big, real risk of significant harm. We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about that. I'm going to probably do most of the talking, and of course, Don's going to jump in when he has pearls of wisdom to share with everybody, or he wants to stump me with some questions. So with that, we're going to move forward. We've got a lot to talk about. We do have some great questions from people already, so we'll try and address those as we move along. If we find we're running out of time, we may just skip some of the slides, but of course the slides will be provided to you after the webinar, probably in the next week or so. Yeah,
and don't forget also that if you have any questions that you want to send in to us, we'll endeavor to answer them later on by email if we can. Not legal advice, it's just communication.
All right, so we've gone through a bit of our agenda, so I'm going to skip that slide. Let's go. So where is your greatest risk? We always say, and what we always find is that the greatest risks are insiders. And insiders do not just mean your employees. Insiders are anybody who has access to your information. They're employees, contractors, business partners, suppliers, service providers, their subcontractors, and technology escrow providers. So you really need to get a handle on and put a fence around who, inside and outside your organization, has access to not only your networks but to information, and that can include professional service providers, your lawyers, your accountants.
Anybody who can interface with your network
and information,
yeah,
absolutely.
That's right.
So, what are the risks? Where's your pain points? So your pain points come from legislation. You've got a few pieces in Canada that have breach notification or breach provisions in them. You've got Pepita, PIPA, which is health, PIPA in Alberta. Externally, you've got GDPR that may apply as well. You've got common law. You've got common law lawsuits, which are picking up steam, and I'm sure our colleagues, our brethren in the class action divisions are thrilled with that. And
you have the privacy commissioners who
yes.
who have their opinions, and their opinions are really pretty powerful.
Yeah, yes.
So,
and that goes to reputation. Aside from the actual breach, if you've got a regulator, the privacy commissioner, calling you out publicly for your mishandling,
that's not good.
That's not a good day.
No,
that's not a good way to
You're
wake up in
the
morning.
Day, yeah.
You're having a bad day.
Yep.
Of course, you've got loss of confidence in your security systems. You've got costs and expenses. Those relate to notification costs, forensic costs, insurance costs, legal costs, PR costs, human resources. There's a lot. When there's a data breach, a lot of human resources stop from operating and just focus on the data breach, and that takes away from generating revenue.
Well, also, data breaches have been famous for reducing corporate value.
Yes.
If you remember the Yahoo case, it cost Yahoo jillions.
Jillions,
yes. It was very expensive.
Absolutely,
yep.
Absolutely. So that gets into the decreasing of company value, and then your investors are going to get on your back, bank financing borrowers and acquiring companies if you're looking to sell or get involved in a purchase-sale deal. And to Don's point, directors and officers' liability, you've got shareholder derivative actions for loss of share value. You saw that in the Wyndham, Target, Home Depot case as well. Breach of fiduciary duty. So these are actions that can be brought against the director. So if you think that you're sheltered because you're acting through a company, or you're just sitting as an officer and director, you can be named in these lawsuits personally. Whether or not they're going to be successful is another thing, but you can expect that your name will be brought in on this. Claims, you've got, again, class actions, regulatory actions, class actions by business partners. People may forget that it's not just the individuals that may bring the class actions. It can be business partners that you're working with. Of course, people get fired.
I hate it when that happens.
I hate it when that happens. So for any high profile and even low profile breaches, your key executives that have any oversight on these matters often lose their jobs, which is, it's not a good day, and it may just that breaches happen, unfortunately, to gain confidence back.
Yeah, they have to throw you under the bus.
They have to throw you under the bus.
That's right.
Right. Okay. So what are the trends we're seeing? Service providers, as we said, people who have access to your networks. What I want to add to that is that your professionals so law firms, accounting firms, consulting firms, anybody who has your information they're being attacked. They're the target to get at your information. Social media. Now that for those of you involved with companies, you may say, well, what do we care about social media? Because that's usually individuals. What I will say is that your company is made up of individuals. They post a lot of information on social media. That can be used to social engineer them, and it can be used to extort them. And we're seeing a trend we'll get later on the increase in extortion or sextortion. Cloud storage, those are great targets because everybody's moving to cloud storage. Cloud storage is the next.
Thank goodness it's mostly pretty secure.
It is, yeah.
But it can. It's a potential.
It is a potential, and we're seeing because there's a lot of data from different organizations, that's a target. Politics and espionage, I think we've seen a lot of that in the media. That may or may not impact you. Ransomware, extortion, and sextortion. We've had ransomware for quite a while. Extortion has grown, and now we're seeing sextortion. And that impacts companies because people are using information that they get about individuals in their organization to get access to their networks. So it is relevant. Payments are increasing. It used to be a couple $100s for ransomware, then a couple thousand. Now we're seeing sort of 6 digits plus for ransomware, depending on the information at issue. Phishing and social engineering. That's been around since the dawn of time, and it continues to be a fan favorite.
It's so elegant because it's targeted at specific people. So you get a note from your boss saying, "What's my password again?" And it turns out that in fact that's not your boss.
And these emails that they get that you'll get for social engineering, they look real.
They're beautiful.
They're beautiful. It's not difficult. There's not a lot of capital investments on the criminals to give effect to social engineering. And it plays on human behavior, which is I want to be responsive, I want to be helpful. And it can be, it will often look like it's coming either from your IT department or your boss asking for, can you send me the spreadsheet? Can you send me the membership list? Can you send me the list of investors? Something like that. And you just respond. And that gets into how we prevent it, which is typically focusing on your employees. And claims arising from inappropriate accessing of information without a disclosure. If you've got internal insiders who just access information inappropriately, we're seeing an increase in claims from that as well. So the focus of this presentation, or a lot of it, is going to be on breach notification, because that's one of the first questions that we get when someone calls us, is who do we have to tell and when. So a lot of the focus lately has been around Pepita, because that just came into effect. The breach notification just came into effect a few months ago. But breach notification has been around in Canada and applicable to Canadian organizations for a long time. PIPA, which deals with health information, and Dawn is an expert in, that's had breach notification obligations for several years. And it actually, one of the differences you'll see between PIPA and PIPA and Pepita is there's not really a reasonable risk, there's not a threshold which the other legislation
the assumption is that personal health information is all sensitive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So with PIPA, if there's an unauthorized access or use, unauthorized access or use, you're going to be notifying the individuals and possibly the commissioner as well. PIPA Alberta, this has been around. They've had breach notification. So this is a Personal Information Protection Act in Alberta. They've had breach notification for years. Pepita, the breach notification clauses were modeled similarly to PIPA. So there's there's learnings we can take from Alberta, and it's good that there's some level of consistency so we don't have significantly different thresholds for when to notify. So the threshold in Alberta, as you'll see, it's very similar to Pepita when we talk about that in a minute, is when there's a loss of or unauthorized access to or disclosure of the personal information where a reasonable person would consider that there exists to be a real risk of significant harm. So again, there's a real risk of significant harm. You'll hear me say reasonable risk of significant harm. That's because there's always this reasonable factor that's both in PIPA and Pepita. So I just skip all the interim words there, and I just say reasonable risk of significant harm. Okay. We'll look at some of the findings from Alberta on what will be a reasonable risk or a real risk of significant harm in a few slides. GDPR. So GDPR, which came into effect a while ago, has breach notification. Their breach notification is quite quick. It's not later than 72 hours after becoming aware of that.
Well, that's the outside bracket.
Yeah.
It has to be essentially immediately.
It does, and we had some questions, Don, about GDPR. So why don't we maybe just address some of those questions?
Yeah, one of them had to do with charities. That came from Andrew. He says, how does the GDPR relate to charities and not-for-profits in Canada? And, of course, it applies. The GDPR doesn't make a distinction between it's designed to protect the personal data of anybody resident in the European Union. And so they don't care, whether it's a charity, a business. It really doesn't matter. It's designed to protect that. So yes, it applies. Another one from Camilo is how is an organization supposed to know if GDPR applies to it if it only does business in Canada? Which is a bit of a circular question. It is kind of, because if it's really true that you do business only in Canada
and on Canadians,
and so the only information you have is on Canadians, then you're okay. The GDPR doesn't apply to you. However, people have this nasty habit of moving and so forth. They come into Canada, they go out of Canada, and so it's really sometimes difficult to say that your records are completely clear of information about a person resident in the European Union.
And just further to that. If you are Canadian, and we get this all the time, we're Canadian companies, how can the GDPR apply? GDPR will apply if you're processing any information on EU residents or people resident in the EU, or you're monitoring their behavior. Monitoring the behavior of EU residents. So even if you're located in Canada, your office, your controlling mind, everything is in Canada, if you have a nexus that we just discussed to EU residents, GDPR will still apply, and the fines for breaching GDPR are nasty.
Yeah, I mean, for example, let's say you're a bank, and you say, well, we only do business in Canada. We don't do business anywhere else. The GDPR doesn't apply to us. I'd have to call you out and say, no, it applies. In fact, if you're not doing business with somebody in Europe at some point, I'm selling my shares.
Now, the good thing, just to take the fear away from the fact that GDPR may apply to you, Pepita and Canadian privacy laws are very similar to the GDPR. I would say there's probably about an 80 to 90% overlap. So there's some nuances that the GDPR, in terms of rights to be forgotten, some higher thresholds for reporting.
And the fines.
And the fines. But so in response to that, our privacy commissioner has now interpreted Pepita in a way which is more consistent with GDPR, and we now have guidance which suggests that the right to be forgotten actually does exist in Canadian privacy laws under Pepita.
I didn't know that, or maybe I just forgot about it.
So the good thing to take away from this is that even if GDPR does apply, if you're compliant with Canadian privacy laws, you're pretty much there. There's some fine-tuning around the edges that you may need. You may need to step up breach notification and be able to track data within your operations a little bit clearer. But it's not a start from scratch scenario.
I just want to say one thing before we leave the subject of speed of notification and so on. If you run a business and you have a service provider that suffers a breach, the service provider can't take the position, I don't have to let you know until some theoretical period of time goes by. As a service provider, the standard for external notice doesn't apply to you because you're inside the tent. And so service providers really have to tell their principals, those for whom they provide the services, immediately, whatever they know, even if they don't know the whole story. And really it's going to be a process of saying, oops, there's a breach, and then further and further information as time goes on about that breach. It's the person or company responsible for the data that has to do the breach notification as primarily responsible. The Federal Privacy Commissioner may have a different view from the one I just said.
We'll get into that a little bit more in a few slides, but absolutely, you've got to make sure that your contracts with your service providers contemplate the timeframes within which you must respond and have obligations that they have to abide by, both on providing notice to you, assistance on the investigation.
Exactly.
And we'll talk about that in a bit. So now let's look at Pepita. So as of November 1st, just a few months ago, although we knew about these for quite a while, Pepita brought into force and effect breach notification obligations. Again, their breach notification, or Pepita's breach notification, depends on a breach of the security safeguards. When there's a breach of the security safeguards that pose a real risk of significant harm, and it's reasonable within the context, there is a real risk of significant harm. So when I say there's a reasonable risk of significant harm, it's because I'm just trying to get rid of some of the verbiage in this. It's reasonable in the context that the breach will pose a real risk of significant harm to individuals. You have to notify individuals of the breach. You may need to notify the Privacy Commissioner, the individuals, and you may need to notify government institutions and other organizations. There's obligations now to notify third-party organizations if they are able to reduce or mitigate the risk of harm. And that can include organizations such as credit reporting organizations. It can involve the police, other third-party.
Sure.
So what does that mean? A breach of security safeguards. So if we work through the obligations under Pepita, the first thing is there a breach of security safeguards? Well, what does that mean? Right?
What are security safeguards?
And what happens if we just choose not to have any? Are we then fine?
No.
The answer is no. So there's the breach of the organization's security safeguards, which are discussed in Clause 4.7 of Schedule 1 of Pepita, and we'll deal with that on the next slide, or from a failure to establish those safeguards. So you can't just avoid breach notification by not having any security.
Yeah, and these safeguards are multiple.
Yes.
They're technological, they're administrative, they're physical security. So if you've got pieces of paper,
right,
you have to lock them up. It's not just about digital networks.
Absolutely. And if you look on this slide, we go through what Principle 7 of the Schedule of Pepita addresses. It says you've got to protect against loss, theft, unauthorized access, disclosure, copying, use, modification, regardless of the format. So this is not just digital, even though we're moving to a digital world. The security requirements depend on the sensitivity of the information. The more sensitive the information, the higher level of protection. Methods of protection, as Don just mentioned, it's not just having good passwords. It's physical measures, locking filing cabinets, restricted access, locking doors, organizational measures, who has security clearance to see the information. Certain jobs within your organization do not need access to certain information. They shouldn't be able to just log in and get it.
Yeah, you can even your business process can be a good way of providing security by dividing a process over a number of people who are discrete one from the other and don't necessarily work together, but they need to coordinate or in some way in order to complete the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, technological measures, passwords, and encryption. Training is very important in establishing security safeguards. We'll talk about that. I can't emphasize that enough. The weakest link is always the individuals. So training, we'll get into that, but training is going to be critical. And security extends to the disposal and destruction of information. So you've done a great job to the end of life of those records, but if you dispose of them or destroy them in a haphazard manner, you're still going to be caught.
Yep.
Okay. So what is this reasonable risk or real risk of significant harm? First of all, you break it down. What's a significant harm? It's very broadly defined. It can include bodily harm, humiliation, damage to your reputation or relationships with your boss, future employers, other people, loss of employment, business, professional opportunities, financial loss, identity theft, negative effects on your credit record, and damage to or loss of property. It's very broadly defined.
Yeah, it doesn't. It's not just limited to a misuse of the information subsequently, although that could be part of it.
Right. So when you're assessing whether there's a reasonable risk of significant harm, you look at two things: the sensitivity of the information involved in the breach, and the probability that the personal information has been, is being, or will be misused. So it's a two-factor test. So what is said? Sorry.
So what's interesting is, for example, if the data that you have is encrypted, it's still personal information, even if it's encrypted in encrypted form, and a loss of it is still a data breach. But it may not lead to an assessment that there's a real risk of significant harm because of the presence of encryption. So you might not need to do all the notifications if you have an encrypted, a breach of encrypted material.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So sensitivity. Well, sensitivity isn't defined, so that means we all have to decide whether something is sensitive or not. Some information is almost always sensitive. You can assume that financial and medical information, health information will be sensitive. But any information can be sensitive depending on the context. Historically, the example was if you, just your mailing address for a magazine, that on the face of it may not be sensitive, but depending on what the magazine subscription is for, to a political party, it could be sensitive. Right now what we're seeing is a lot of email or mailing lists associated with the cannabis sector, where I think we're seeing that as being sensitive information. And there's a lot of requests, actually, access to information requests on cannabis investors and cannabis companies. So you've got to look at both the information at issue and the context of that personal information and make that judgment about whether or not we feel like this is sensitive in that circumstance. So the circumstances can make the information more or less sensitive, and the potential harm is also an important factor of whether or not it's going to be sensitive. The next part of the test is what's the probability of misuse? And that goes to Don's point about encryption. You may have sensitive information. If it's encrypted, is there a probability of misuse? Could you actually access that information? You have to look at a number of factors when there's a probability of misuse. Who accessed it? What were the circumstances in which they accessed it? What was their motivation for accessing it? Was it an accidental? Was it intentional? How long has it been exposed? Was there malicious intent? A number of pieces of personal information being breached. They tend to think the more information out there, the higher the risk of it being misused. Who is that information in the hands of? And then was the information exposed to limited or known entities who have committed to destroy and not disclose the data? So to give you an example, we had a situation a couple weeks ago where a company had, through a mailing mix-up, digital mailing mix-up, had sent investor information to the wrong people. So investor A got investor B's information, investor B got investor C's information. So it was a bit of a mail mix-up. It was potentially sensitive information.
Sure.
But they were all related or friends. So they were all contacted, so the individuals were notified. And they all said, oh,
Yeah.
no problem.
Tear it up.
We're teared up, makes no difference to us. So in that situation, is there a breach? Yes. Is there potentially is there sensitive information? It's financial? Yes. Is there a reasonable risk that there's going to be harm there? When you have written assurances from people that they all know each other, their family or friends, we felt that there was a very low risk. And this was, I think, 10 people involved, so it was quite a small group. So let's look at some of the lessons learned from the Alberta PIPA on the real risk of significant harm. I only picked a few from the last few months. The Privacy Commissioner's website in Alberta has a great...
lots of them, yeah.
Yeah, they're great, and they're very easy. They're 3 pages long, and they'll give you a sense for the analysis that they're going through to determine whether there's a real risk of significant harm. I just picked 4. As mentioned, financial, social insurance numbers, health information will almost always require notification. As well, email addresses are seen to be sensitive in most of the circumstances, which I question, but the view is, and we'll go through it, the view is that the email addresses are going to be used for phishing and for coercing people into identity theft or fraud. So I just picked a few that I thought had some interesting lessons learned. Little League, it was a decision from March of 2019. The decision was there was a reasonable risk of significant harm. All of these examples are reasonable risk of significant harm. This was a not-for-profit, so that's important. The member list, name, phone number, email. So, on the face of it, not the most sensitive information. And it was related to a Little League, so it's not even, something... in fact, many people would be quite proud of being associated with the Little League. But the volunteer took the list, and used it to solicit members for a competing league.
An even littler league.
An even littler league, that's right.
Imagine.
The Privacy Commissioner found that the personal information emails could be used for phishing purposes and increasing the vulnerability of identity theft and fraud. The risk was increased because it was a deliberate action by the volunteer. The organization was not able to recover the information and did not receive confirmation that the individual would not be further used or disclosed. As well, some of the information contained was on children. So you've got a vulnerable sector there.
And that's always bad because kids won't find out for a decade and a half that their information is being misused, right. And they've got a terrible credit rating as soon as they hit 21 for no reason.
That's right.
Yeah.
The next one was a decision. It was on a gym. The decision came out in February 2019. Again, not a ton of personal information or sensitive initial information. It was a name, address, the services of the gym that were purchased, the purchase price, amount, and timing of payments. So there were some email addresses and dates of birth and contact information. There was no banking information. There was no social insurance numbers. And this was a situation where the gym was testing a new e-delivery for contracts, which is similar to the circumstances I just mentioned, and the members received contracts for the other members. So the Privacy Commissioner, I thought, was an interesting decision. They found that the information on the standard contracts couldn't be used to cause significant harm. So the standard pricing, that was fine. But emails can be used for phishing. They found that could lead to reasonable risk of significant harm. And the date of birth could be used for identity theft and fraud. So again, reasonable risk of significant harm, they have to notify. Excuse me.
The other thing is that, if you, for phishing purposes, if you get something from your gym that says click here, you might be more inclined to do that and download some malware than if it's from a complete stranger. Especially if you just recently signed up for that gym. You might do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Last 2 examples. The media company example from February of 2019. We had a variety of information, or there was a variety of information in that example: email address, mailing address, phone number, username, password, date of birth, mother's maiden name. What made this one interesting is because the new owner of a website, so there was a company, historical company that sold part of its activities to another company. Then the new company received extortion demand arising from the illegally accessing personal information through the website. So the Privacy Commissioner determined that, yes, the email, as we expected for this one, email, mother's maiden name, date of birth, username, passwords, all wonderful, wonderful ways to affect identity theft and fraud. So that was an expected result. I thought the facts were interesting on that one. And then this last one, which was an addiction treatment center in Atlanta, Georgia, U.S. So this is about a U.S. company, and we get this question a lot from our U.S. or international clients. It's a foreign company. This
could be Canadians on the list.
They had one Alberta resident, and they weren't even sure that the information on that Alberta resident was involved, and there was no evidence of harm. But given the nature of the information, it was an addiction treatment center. It had the name, date of birth, social insurance number, diagnostic, so health information. They felt that because the nature of the information, the fact that there was only one resident, they couldn't even confirm that it was involved. You've got to notify the individual about the breach. So what do we do? How do we help, or how do we prepare for this? The first thing is try to develop a breach framework so that all breaches are assessed with consistent criteria. So what does that mean? In your organization, given the facts or the criteria that we've just discussed, when will information that you have be considered sensitive information? So again, if you've got health, finances, you should by default think that that's going to be sensitive information. If you have just email addresses, could that be sensitive information? I think you should default to yes. If you just have mailing addresses and names, maybe not, but look at the context. And then let's look at the probability of misuse. So play out different scenarios in your breach framework. In what circumstances will you think, or will you reasonably believe, or could substantiate that there's a risk of significant harm?
I mean, the lesson here, obviously, is that you have to have you can't wait until there's a breach and say, oh, now what will we do? You have to have thought about this in advance and have a procedure in place.
Yeah, we'll absolutely. The first, we'll talk about that if we've got time. The first 72 hours, forget the GDPR requirement, we've always said this, the first 72 hours under any breach is incredibly important, and you just can't get your feet under you once you find out about a breach. You need to know reporting channels and who needs to know what and how you're going to respond right away so that you can just make those phone calls and have those conversations quickly and efficiently. So who reports the breach? And establishing the framework ahead of time will also give you a little bit more credibility. And we'll get into that in a little bit later, a few more slides, because regardless of whether you have to notify, you still have to keep records and reports of all incidents of breaches.
Oh yeah, even if they're not, if there's no rush. Yeah.
So this framework will allow you to properly report your decisions, whether there is a risk and you must report or notify, or there's not, and why not.
And then you just record it.
Yes, yeah. So I think Don reached on this, or touched on this a bit earlier. Who reports the breach? Because that's always a question. Who reports, especially when you've got multiple channels of processing and sub-processing? The position of the Privacy Commissioner is that in almost all circumstances, it should be the initial or the principal organization who controlled the collection of the data and how that data is supposed to be used. That should be the organization that notifies or reports to the Privacy Commissioner. That can be challenging when you've got multiple layers of processors and sub-processors. So control, so the organization that has control, we deem that as a principal organization. Control is not defined by Pepita, but if you look at the accountability principle in Pepita, it's the organization who initially collects it and transfers it to the third party for processing. That's the controller. Business relationships are complex and they often evolve, so what may be a standard controller or processing relationship may evolve and change over time, and you've got to make sure that your contracts, which we'll touch on in the next slide, account for all of this. And just because you're a processor, if those of you who are processors out there, you're not kicking back your feet at this point because you may still have obligations under PIPEDA as well.
Including mitigation obligations, right?
Yep. So what does this mean for your principal organization? You've got to perform your due diligence on all processors of information. You've got to ensure you've got contractual provisions in place to deal with personal information and breaches, restrictions on the collection, use, disclosure, security safeguards, notification. Notification as soon as possible, because if you've got timeframes you have to meet on your end, they have to notify you in advance of that so you can take in that information, synthesize it, and figure out what you need to do with it. Assistance on investigations, record-keeping obligations. So we'll touch on record-keeping obligations in a bit, but if you have record-keeping obligations, so must your processors. And the contract terms must be able to evolve with changing relationships in the laws.
Among the questions you have to ask, for example, for a SaaS processor, where do you keep your servers? Is it in Hillary Clinton's spare office? Is it in a 27,000 ISO 27001 compliant data center? Guess which one is better. So these are the kinds of things you have to dig into. It's just not a matter of asking questions. If they say, well, we're in a such and such a data center, you can say, let me see the certificate for that center. What compliance standards do they follow? And because you'll get the blame.
That's right.
You will get the blame.
That's right. You can't just point to your processors and say it's their fault and just put all the blame on them. That doesn't work that way. Are there financial penalties? Because every organization wants to know, so what? So what if there's a breach? Yes, there are financial penalties. In addition to all those wonderful common law, statutory, decrease in shareholder value, all those things that we talked about earlier, yes, there's financial penalties if you fail, if you contravene PIPEDA's reporting, notification, and record-keeping requirements. So how soon do you have to notify? As soon as feasible after you've determined that there's been a breach. You must report, you must notify. Sorry, a breach that involves a real risk of significant harm. You must notify them as soon as feasible. I've put some information here on what to include on the notification. The general gist of this, and you can read it, so I'm not going to go through all of it. The general gist of it is you need to inform the individual, give the individuals enough information to know what happened, when it happened, what personal information is at issue, what you're taking to reduce the harm, and contact information if they have any questions about that. And in terms of how to respond strategically, in almost all situations, it makes sense to tell the individuals. Whether or not you report it to the commissioner, it almost always makes sense to report, other than in very limited circumstances, to just tell the individuals. Individuals are generally aware that breaches happen. There's not the panic that we saw 5 to 10 years ago when these things were reported. They get that this happens. Does it mean that you're going to go through some headaches and possibly some people reaching out to say, give me $2,000, $5,000 because you've breached it? Maybe. But you also mitigate your damages by giving people the information as soon as possible, telling them how to mitigate their damages. Overall, you're getting ahead of the message, you're communicating your message, you're giving people all the information and tools that they need to mitigate the risk so that overall your damage is less. And if you end up talking or reporting to the privacy commissioner, the fact that you've already notified the individual goes a long way to them saying, okay, you're being reasonable about this. We may monitor you. We may still slap you on the wrist. But the fact that you've notified the individual will go a long way to helping you.
And if you do the opposite, if you're covering that up and then you won't be at the top of their Christmas list at any time soon. And that kind of behavior just makes you look slimy.
It does. And if you think that it's not going to get out,
it always gets out.
It always gets out. It always happens, whether it's this week or in a month or 2 months, it always gets out. And then, as Don said, you just look shady. You're looking like you're trying to hide something, which is, that's never a good position to start from. So record keeping. Forget about the real risk of significant harm. If there is a breach of security safeguards, you must keep records about the breach. Full stop. Okay? It requires you to keep them for 2 years, although you may have to keep them longer. And you've got to keep all records that describe the type of the information that was involved, how it happened, the steps that you took to correct it, and then your assessment of whether or not it created a real risk of significant harm or not.
Yeah. I mean, there are some regulated professions, for example, accountants, who are obliged to keep records concerning their service. And so if a breach occurs in the context of their service, they have to keep that record actually for as long as any other, for example, audit-based records that they have to keep concerning their service. 7 years?
Could be, yeah. So 2
yeah.
years minimum, could be longer depending on your legal obligations. And that those record-keeping obligations need to flow down in every contract involving processors, sub-processors, contractors, that sort of thing. So again, what should the record contain? Date or estimated date of the breach, circumstances of the breach, nature of the information involved, whether or not the breach was reported, and support whether there was a real risk of significant harm.
You may not even know when the breach took place. A lot of these breaches occur over a period of 9 months even.
Yeah.
And so you keep a record to the best of your knowledge as to what happened.
That's a key point when we're talking about breaches. Oftentimes incursions happen. I think the average is about 270 days before it's detected. So you may not be able to pinpoint it happened on July 15th. You have an estimate. That also goes to the point of your IT department doing regular checks doing incursion tests or checks to see what's going on. Okay, so response teams and strategies. It's got to be appropriate for your organization. So we look at organizations that are startups and multinationals, and the plan in principle is the same, but how it's operationalized can be very, very different. So it's got to be relevant to the nature of the personal information in your organization, the size of your organization, the reporting channels, private company versus public company. First 72 hours is key. This is why we always say you've got to get your response plan, your breach plan in place now, because you can't be fumbling through this and figuring this out, whether you're small or big. Small, you can be nimble and you can react. You know that it may be one person who's responsible for IT, human resources, you're the CEO, that could be it. Larger companies, it's a little bit more complex, but you need to have something in place to know who is the first person that's called, who needs to know, what messages are being sent. Do we have a PR issue? Do we have a public relations department, or do we need a public relations firm on standby to help you out if you're a larger organization? Yeah,
it's multidisciplinary. It certainly isn't something that, for example, only your lawyer or only your spin doctor can do. It has to involve everybody.
Yeah. And lawyers often get the first call, and I don't dissuade that, but I will always say, have you called your insurance company first? Do you have insurance? If you do, call your insurance company to see, is this covered, is this not? You do not want to take any steps that are going to throw you offside your insurance.
Yeah, and the next thing you want to do is not send a lot of emails inside the company.
That's right, saying, there's been a big breach. And right, so that's part of the plan. What's the communication channel internally?
Yep.
And that's not trying to be shady. It's just there's a lot of misinformation or unknowns in the first few days of a data breach. And sending emails they often contain erroneous and completely false and inaccurate information. And yet, those can be discoverable if this comes to a lawsuit.
Yeah, they will be.
So the last few slides are our data breach plan and then some prevention. The data breach plan, as we've been talking all along, it's like an emergency plan. You should have it in place. Again, it can be bigger or smaller scaling on the type of organization you have. So you shouldn't be daunted by the fact or the idea of having to put a breach plan in place. You just need to have a plan now so that when this happens, and it's not if, it will happen, what do?
Everybody's IT department already has a plan for when this or that or something else happens that doesn't necessarily involve a data breach. There are plans for outages, there are There are all kinds of plans. Business continuity plans, disaster recovery plans, and good companies will have regular sort of lifeboat drills on these things to make sure that they work. And that's part of what you said before about training, right? People have to, you have to practice stuff before you get good at it.
Absolutely. So identify the potential breach scenarios. So your breach plan starts with identifying potential breach scenarios. That assumes a good understanding of the personal information and the handling practice of your organization. What information do you have? Where is it? What's the nature of it? How could it be breached? Then who's in charge? Who gets notified first? This person must be senior enough and knowledgeable enough to make good decisions fast. How does this person get the information he or she needs? Who does this person need immediate access to in order to get answers to immediate questions? That's usually your IT department. Depending on the information, it could be your HR department if it's employee information.
Or it could be the service provider if that's where the problem is. Right?
Absolutely.
Certain contact there.
Good point. What personal information was involved, on whom, where's the breach coming from, how did it happen, how long has the breach gone on, that sort of thing. Like, that's the information that you're going to need if you're leading the breach response. So if you look at the information you need, who do you need to speak with right away, minute one, to figure that out? So then we look at who needs to be notified generally. We talked about who needs to be notified first. That should be someone senior enough. It is often the senior Chief Information Officer, the CIO, if it's an IT breach. It could be your CEO. It could be the head of HR. Again, depending on where the breach is. Externally, do you notify individuals, privacy commissioners, insurers? I really can't emphasize, reach out to your insurance companies first. Breach insurance, and I think there was a question about that. How does that work with breaches?
Yeah, it may not work.
It may not work. Data breach insurance is relatively new. When you look at like directors and officers insurance, which has been around since the dinosaurs, the language has been tried. It's been fully vetted over decades, generations. Cyber breach insurance is not. There's differences in coverage. There's differences in language. You may find that what you think is covered is not covered. For instance, people have maybe cyber breach, but if it was social engineered and you voluntarily gave the information away, there's some cases out there that have said you voluntarily gave that information away.
Well, sure.
So that you're not insured for that.
And in the context of ransomware artists, not only, for example, they might do a double breach where they get all the information and then they put ransomware and they turn all your machines into bricks. That won't be covered by cyber insurance.
And there was a relatively new, at least from what I'm seeing, and Don, you may have seen this longer, but there are companies now that are acting as intermediaries on ransomware. Yeah. The ransomware dollar values are now significantly high, so now we have contracts with intermediaries who will negotiate with the ransomware extorters on your behalf, and sometimes insurance will cover that cost.
Yes. So it's like hostage negotiators.
It's a brave new world. It's a brand new world out there.
What do you do for a living? I'm a ransomware
That's right.
negotiator.
I'm a negotiator for ransomware with criminals. I'm sure there's a TV show out there about that.
Oh, yeah, there's one coming for sure.
What information needs to be included in the notification? That depends on who you're notifying, obviously, and what they need to know and when. Is there a media communications department? Do you need to notify them? Do we have to get out in front of this from the media, from the public PR perspective? Prevention. And I think this is our last slide. So we can't stress this enough. One of the cheapest and easiest ways to prevent data breaches, whether it's in physical format or digital format, is to train your employees. And this doesn't mean a one and done where someone comes in as a talking head and just lectures employees for an hour and you check the box. That's not good training. This can be a few lunch and learns followed up by testing of your employees. Sending phishing emails to see whether someone's going to take the bait. Leave flash drives around. your office and see who's going to pick them up and just try and install them or use them on the firm's computer or the organization's computer. You must, so it's ongoing training. It's ongoing auditing. And it's not just with employees. It's contractors or anybody who has access to your information. Audit, spot check, and then I say rinse and repeat. Because it's not just one and done. It can't be. This is something, whether it's a clean desk policy, people are moving to the open space in their offices, so anybody can walk by your monitor. How do you deal with that? People are working from home. How are you dealing with the transportation of information from office to home or accessing from home to office? People printing at their home, what are they doing with that? Are they shredding it? Are they putting it in their recycling? It's complicated.
Is it a wireless printer?
Is it a wireless printer? There's training, again, it's your IT department absolutely has a front and center role in securing your network, without question. And for the most part, we find that the IT departments do a pretty good job, and they often will work with other people within their industry to figure out what's the latest and greatest threats and how to prevent them. We often forget about the employees. It's one of the cheapest ways and the easiest ways to protect your organization. Make sure everybody has a unique access per an individual. One of the data breaches, and I use this term lightly because it was a case that still irritates me. It was brought a couple years ago, and it was involved a medical office. And it was, they get hundreds of patients daily through their office, and people would leave, their screens on because logging in and out, it just wasn't, they couldn't almost do it fast enough to keep up with the patient flow. And so other people would have access to the patient records that were just up on the screen, so you didn't have to log in and log out all the time. And if you did have to log in and log out, you knew exactly what the other person's username and password was. The password was defaulted for everybody, and the username was first initial, last name. So it was incredibly easy for anybody else to log in under anybody else's credentials, and there's no way to really monitor. Without a trace. And there was no way to monitor who had access. Now, in this situation, there was no harm. It was a beef between siblings. But unfortunately, it still cost about $100,000.
Mom always liked me best.
It was pretty much that, yeah. Unfortunately, you still get dragged through the mud. So I know it's a pain, but really try to be usernames and passwords. Let's be creative on these, and we can talk about ways about how to maintain the 100 passwords that you need to maintain. There are ways to do that, but let's not default to everybody having this, the same password and usernames being so predictable. Updates, and this ties in with insurance. When you get cyber breach insurance, the obligations that insurance policy will put on the organization they're almost like a frontline defense, because they obligate you to install patches and fixes within 30 to 60 days or even tighter. So one of the things when you're looking at cyber breach insurance is make sure your IT department is involved in those discussions, because they have to live up to those obligations. While it sounds easy enough to say, well, we'll just install it in a few days, it actually is not easy in many instances to install patches, fixes, and updates. You actually have to shut down your networks.
And you have to test them, make sure that they don't break something else, and it's complicated. Yeah,
so make sure that your IT department is involved in those discussions and that they're on side with how this is going to work. If you do not, even if you feel like you've done all the right things, you've done all the training, you've done, you've gotten out, you've gotten that wonderful policy. You've got a great IT department, but if it wasn't installed in the right time, you're going to void your insurance policy.
Well, in other words, it's the opposite of the way it is with motor vehicle insurance, where once you have your insurance policy, from what I can see, apparently you can drive like a bonehead, and it's okay. Whereas with cyber insurance, if you fail to keep up with the requisites, not prerequisites, the ongoing requisites of your policy, then your policy may be voided. It's not good.
Secure, encrypt data, both in transit and at rest. Okay, if you can, try to encrypt. If you encrypt things, people access it, it gets lost on a flash drive that's encrypted. We have pretty good arguments to say that there's not a reasonable risk of harm. Not only do we not have to notify, but the real, we don't expect that there's going to be any harm or misuse from this information. It isn't necessarily easy to encrypt, and I get that. So you have to be practical. But if there's a way you can do this, we strongly recommend encrypting whenever possible.
Well, John, who I won't mention his last name because that would be a data breach, but he works at one of our clients and has written in, and he says that look, all encryption can be broken with enough time. And so you have to assume that sooner or later it's going to be clear text, and if it's valuable, people are going to hack away at it until they finally decrypt it. Mm-hmm. And so, his point, I guess, is, okay, if it's encrypted, isn't it sooner or later going to be a risk of significant harm? And that is a very interesting argument, and that's the one that everybody has.
Right.
It's a little bit like having an alarm on your house, and a good lock. They'll just go somewhere else, one hopes. Mm-hmm. But if they really, really want it, they'll get it.
Yeah. And maybe at some point in the future, encryption will be easily broken, and the risk of harm as a result will be increased. But I don't think we're there yet.
No. I'm saving up for a quantum computer.
What we are seeing, which is, I don't know how much of interest this is for people, but the password breakers are increasing as an industry. And so basic passwords, even if they are not words found in a dictionary, they are being broken at an increasingly speedy rate. So it may be that passwords at some point are not really seen as the security we think they are. We always recommend multi-factor security, so it's not just a password. It's a username, password, a token, like an externally generated token that's randomly generated to get in. So multi-factor authentication is something that we absolutely recommend at all instances, and that's a pain, but it's 30 seconds of pain, but it does add reasonable security at this point. Breach response plan, I guess that shouldn't be under updates, but it should be under its own heading. But yes, that is in prevention. When you go through a plan of how to respond to a breach, you realize your pain points and where you need to fix or what you need to focus on, and you tend to reduce the amount of breaches when you go through the process of developing a breach plan. So we highly recommend that as well. We have, I think, 1 minute or so.
Yeah, maybe we should take a look at one of these questions, Paige. There's a here's one. If a breach occurs but there's no significant harm, it has to be recorded. But does it still have to be reported? The answer is no. It only has to be reported if there's a real risk of significant harm. Note that it's a risk. You don't actually have to address it that there doesn't have to be actual harm. It's just is there a risk of it, and is that risk a real risk, and therefore to be real it has to be reasonable. And that's from Camilo. It's a good question. Does the GDPR apply if a client happens to be a European citizen, but the business is not aware of this? This is one of these, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to hear it, it fell, for crying out loud.
Yes, even if you don't, if you're not aware if there's an EU resident involved, yes, GDPR can apply. Now, we also have to balance this by some reasonable assessments of risk, and if there's 1 out of 1 million people that are in the EU, does it apply? Technically, yes. Is there a risk to your organization? Perhaps a moderate risk to your organization. So I think that is it for now. We can try and reach out to people who
let's get a hold of people by email.
And it was wonderful of you to join us, and we look forward to the next webinar offered by our firm. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful Wednesday.
Bye, everybody.